Thank you, Mr. President. Members, please be seated. I want to thank the President and my colleagues for allowing us to do this over the years, to take time to celebrate the man, the life, his legacy, and his accomplishments. I often ponder what made Martin Luther King such a bold and courageous leader. And so I did a little reading, and I found out that his leadership skills came from his mom and his dad. They gave him the authority to use his voice whenever he saw injustices in the corners of where he lived. And he cited three very specific examples that kind of cemented in his mind. One example that he shared is when he saw a black man be lynched. That broke his heart. The other regulation that he talks about in reference to wanting to speak to injustice was when his mom and dad took him into a shoe store. And the owner of the shoe store said you had to go to the back. He couldn't understand why there was this separate but equal kind of concept. But they went to the back and they bought the shoes. Then throughout his life, he saw more Jim Crow laws, separate schools. When there was a bus, you had to sit on the back. If you had to go to a hospital, you had to go to a different hospitals. Everything was separate, and he wasn't allowed to be integrated with people who weren't people of color. And he wanted to lend voice to that. And so that's how it got started. If you don't know, Martin Luther King Jr.'s father was a pastor. And so he was able to kind of hear the messages from his dad from the pulpit as he was growing up as a child. And he remembers those injustices that he had to live with. And he wanted to do something about it. You see, I believe that all of us have the ability to be leaders and to have courage and to lend our voice when we see injustice in the world. But what really kicked it off, and things that we need to remember, are the women that played a serious role as it relates to the civil rights movement. And there's two women I want to mention. First, I want to mention his wife, Coretta Scott King. Many of the men that are here, you probably have wives, and you know how they know how to manage you and your money, right? So Coretta Scott King was very good at being a partner, a strong partner for him as it relates to the movement. The second woman I would like to mention, of course, is Rosa Parks, because she was the platform for the King's movement. We all know the story of Rosa Parks. She was tired, and so she refused to give up her seat to a white man. So she sat in the front of the bus. And that started a movement. And in that movement, what happened in the black community is that they didn't ride the bus. Similar to what you might see going on right now at King Soopers, where people are striking, and some people cross the lines and some people don't. But when Rosa Parks decided not to give up her seat, the community rallied around her. And they organized. And the way they organized is that they did ride shares. And so they would take turns and they would have their own like public transportation. But some of them had to walk to work. And it went on and on and on. So after 2 months of this, and it went on longer than 2 months, but after 2 months, Dr. Martin Luther King gave a speech. And in reading, he said that he was weary that day. And when he looked at the congregation, he saw that they were weary too. Because it takes a toll on you when you don't have transportation to get to where you need to be. And he could see the frustration on their face. And so he was going on with his message, and then all of a sudden, a friend of his came to him and said, "You need to go home because your house has been bombed. And we don't know the status of Coretta Scott King, your wife, or your daughter." So he was honest with the congregation. He told them what had happened, and he said, please just go in peace. And so he left. By the time he got home, there was a crowd outside of his house. And the crowd outside his house had sticks, they had guns, they had weapons, they had knives. And the police were there as well. But the police at the time, the crowd didn't know if they were protecting the kings or were they protecting the crowd that was going to do something. So they were like confused. When he got into the house, he saw his wife and he saw his daughter, and they were okay, but they were shaken. But the police chief said, could you please go out and talk to the crowd? And he did. And I think he did that for two reasons. He did that to let the crowd know that his wife and his daughter was okay. So that was a personal reason. The other reason he did, I think, was a public reason. And when he came to talk to the crowd, he says, please go home. Go home in peace. If you have weapons or a gun or whatever you have, put them away. Because one of the principles I stand for is love, and I stand for nonviolence. So please go home. Now, the police chief really appreciated that because people did go home, and there was no violence that day. But it did shake up the family because it was a constant kind of drilling of his life where people hated him or didn't like the power that he had or the message that he was having, because it was about integration. And when you talk about integration, you're talking about changing a culture. It's talking about, where you have diversity and inclusion. And a lot of people weren't ready for that. And so people in the community were saying to Dr. King and Coretta Scott King, we want you to move out of state. We want your family to be safe. And I'm going to read the quote that she says. She says here, she said, I married Dr. Martin Luther King. And when I married him, I married the movement. She later told Dr. King that I'm not going to leave you, because if I leave you, I will be leaving the movement. That is the power that this woman played in the movement as it relates to the civil rights movement. She had the courage to stay despite the threats against her family. So when I ponder on this question, how do you be courageous? And how do you be bold when it's not popular? What I learned from him is that it takes love. Because you can't drive out darkness with more darkness. The only way you can drive out darkness is in light. And you know that when you're at home. When you turn on the light switch, when it's dark, you have light. So what he has done with his life is he has encouraged us to be the light of the world. So I'm encouraging each of you to be like King. Thank you, Mr. President.